Hello, and welcome back to Measuring Learner Data and Assessment. This is Week 3, Lecture 3, The Impact of Bias on Assessment and the Measurement of Learner Data. Assessment, and particularly standardized testing, is a hot-button issue in the education world. It is used widely and supposed to be trusted as a measure of student achievement across content areas and grade levels. We've discussed how to ensure that standardized tests and assessments as a whole are reliable and valid. But how do we make sure they are fair? This lecture will focus on answering that question through a discussion on how bias impacts assessment and the measurement of learner data, and how we can attempt to combat bias. How does bias impact assessment? First, we have to discuss types of bias. Construct validity bias. As discussed in this week's previous lecture, construct validity is used to describe how well an assessment actually assesses what it purports to assess. Construct validity bias is present when some factor gets in the way of an assessment doing what it is supposed to be doing. For example, I have a student in my third period class who just immigrated from China. She is rapidly learning conversational English, but still struggles with the academic vocabulary. We translate her assessments into her native Cantonese, but did not on her very first assessment, not realizing the extent to which her inexperience with English went. She did very poorly. This grade in no way reflected her knowledge of the content. It instead reflected a high amount of construct validity bias. Content validity bias. This happens when the content covered on an assessment is easier for one group to answer correctly than another group. For example, an economics teacher from an upper middle class background teaches in a school that has recently had an influx of migrant students from socioeconomically underprivileged backgrounds. The teacher gives a quiz that is based entirely on the precept of budgeting one's allowance, not understanding that students from a disadvantaged background might not have had an allowance will create content validity bias for that group. A more specific type of this bias would be item selection bias, where specific items on that assessment are included that are more difficult for a certain group of students. For example, an inclusion class that includes 9 ENL students has a vocabulary quiz that gets progressively difficult. In an effort to modify the quiz in order to be more fair to the ENL population, the teacher includes some basic conversational Spanish terms as part of the quiz. This would create item selection bias that would negatively impact the non-Spanish speakers in the classroom. Predictive validity bias. This is present when an assessment does not do a good job of predicting how well a group of students will do on a future assessment. For example, as previously discussed, the global history teachers in my school use a database of previously utilized assessment questions to create their tests and midterms. This does not always accurately predict how well a given cohort of students will do on the state exam at year's end. There are other types of bias as well. They're not as measurable, but definitely can be present in assessment and the measuring of learner data. One is cultural bias. When the person creating the assessment or proctor fails to understand or, in some cases, take into account the culture of the students taking the assessment. This can present as content and/or construct validity bias, but can also present in the proctoring grading phases of assessment. Example of this, I'm in New York, you're in California. This is something I worry about impacting this very course. Second, regional bias. Similar to cultural bias, this refers to a situation where the person creating or proctoring the assessment is from a different regional background than those being assessed. This can lead to more content and/or construct validity bias in the creation of the assessment, as I've seen on diagnostic exams that have questions about walking on a dirt road that make absolutely no sense to urban students, or in the grading phase of the assessment. I have the same fear here. I'm in New York, you're in California. Regional bias could be impactful. Third, generational bias. When the person creating the assessment is of a significantly different generation than those taking the assessment, issues can arise. Many of my students have never seen a traditional landline telephone. So to include a picture of or an item detailing one in an assessment would be confusing at best and unanswerable at worst for them. So how do we fight bias? Throughout this course, I have consistently referred to education as both a practice and a profession. As a function of both, one of the major aspects of what we do is reflection. There may not be a more impactful area to reflect on than bias. That is the best way we can combat bias in our assessments, through reflection. Teaching, while it can sometimes feel extraordinarily solitary, is a collaborative process. Some of the best resources to combat bias in assessments are around you as educators. I would suggest a 3-step process for reflection when it comes to assessments. Step 1, self-reflection. Write your assessment. Put it down and come back to it sometime later. Reread it with the purpose of looking for bias. Step 2, colleague reflection. Ask other professionals in your school to look over the assessment. It might be helpful to focus on colleagues that are experts in the fields that might be impacted by bias in your assessment. For example, E&L teachers, special education teachers, psychologists, and social workers. Step 3, student reflection. Students can be great barometers, whether they know it or not, of bias in assessments. What do I mean by whether they know it or not? Well, students will be honest with you about how they found the assessment. Listen to them. I make it a point to ask them after they complete a quiz or a test if they thought it was fair. Most will be honest and let you know whether or not they felt the assessment covered what you thought it covered. Their grades will also tell you a lot. If you have created an assessment that you feel is both reliable and valid, and you feel that it fairly represents what has been taught in class, but the grades don't reflect your expectations, then it might be possible that the students are inadvertently telling you that your assessment is biased. This discussion is obviously centered around recognizing and correcting bias in your own assessments. You may be in a situation, however, where you recognize bias in assessments that you didn't write, those that were created by the district, state, or outside agency. You still have a responsibility to act when you recognize bias, even in these other assessments. I would suggest conferencing with a superior if the bias is in a locally or state-created assessment to decide on proper next steps, or to find out who to inform. If the assessment is company-created, there should be contact info on it somewhere. Use that info and share your concerns with the people that made the assessment. You should also share your concerns with your school and district so that assessment choices can be made with the greatest amount of information possible. Reliability and validity are paramount to assessments. Knowledge of the different kinds of reliability and validity, as well as the kinds of bias that can impact them, and a clear plan for ensuring them while limiting bias are positive steps in our quest to measure learner data and utilize assessment in the most effective way possible.